So I think it's really important, the distribution engine around content, because you can't rely on or count on a blog post just by itself magically doing well, or a social media post if you don't have a following. So if I was a brand, I would just start email collection as early as possible and offering value upfront through a newsletter.
Sometimes it is not what you say, but how you say it that captures people's attention. This is true for marketing. You might say the same thing over and over again, but when you tweak how you say it, the customer responds to you better. Finding your voice as a brand and the point of view with content does not come easily. But to stand out amongst your competitors, sometimes your voice is the difference between you and another brand battling for the attention of the same customer. Welcome to How to Market Your D2C Brand, a show where we interview founders and marketers in the D2C space to learn about how they have grown their brands and current best practices in marketing. This show is brought to you by Goodo Studios, a photo and video creation studio that works with consumer brands to make content that converts viewers into customers. And I'm your host, Matthew Gutozzi. Today's guest is Natalie Sportelli, head of content at Thing Testing, a media company bringing unsponsored takes on brands. I started out the interview asking why writing is so important to a brand.
Brands approach writing in a couple different ways. That could look like a blog, that could look like copywriting, email, social. It's kind of how a brand talks. But ultimately, it's really important because it's a way to tell your story, share why you're differentiated. Founder origin stories are really compelling, and kind of really just like sharing why you exist, I think, is the initial touch point that a lot of people have with a brand's writing. But then from there, how can a brand offer value by answering questions, creating community around, resources that they're making. So there are really just so many opportunities for a brand to use writing to, offer more value to customers, even if they haven't bought the product yet, and answer questions.
How does a brand go about developing their voice and perspective for their content?
I think especially in crowded categories where you see a ton of brands, doing something maybe similar but having their own spin on it. Developing a voice for your brand, a tone and your perspective is really about trying to figure out like what is unique about your company. That could be the product itself, that could be the way it was built, the reason why it was built. A lot of brands differentiate again through like the reason that they exist in the world. So matching kind of your value to customers with how you talk about the product, I think is really important. If you're a brand that is selling probiotic sodas or something, like that's going to sound very different, I think, than a golf club company or something, right? So I think determining your perspective and voice is around knowing who your customer is and how do they talk, and kind of mirroring what that dialogue looks like and the people you're trying to reach.
I wanted to dig deeper with Natalie to pull out what are those exercises a brand can do to develop their voice and persona.
Ultimately, interviews with customers and like really understanding what they're looking for in the brand, because, in some cases people will really connect with a brand because of a unique tone or perspective, but in other cases it might be like a little off-putting. Why is this brand, you know, their whole thing is kind of insulting customers, or like what's their vibe? So I think tactically, just again, like listening to how their customers are talking and how they talk about the product themselves through UGC, through interacting with the socials is really important. But then also just kind of feeling what is authentic to the brand. If you feel like you're overstretching, or the social media manager slash content person is like, this doesn't really feel like the right fit, then it's worth reassessing. So I think it is trial and error, and you're not going to know immediately how a brand talks. A brand is not a person, but you kind of have to evolve it and adapt it to who you're talking to, and kind of trial and error.
So, how should brands continue to build their content once they find their voice?
I mean, then you've kind of done the hard part, right? So you kind of have found your niche and your perspective and your tone. And from there, I think it's even more about seeing what's been working well. So if you see that a post or a social media, posts, blog posts, anything that you've shared across your different channels as content has performed well, then the next question is, all right, well, what's kind of something a little like this that can inform the next thing we do? So, for example, a blog post does really well. A really traditional content marketing trick is how can you resurface similar information in a different way? And I think for brands, seeing, what's been performing well and then what's like the next logical thing that people ask would be really helpful. So, kind of word clouding. All right, this topic really resonated. Like, what are some of the other touch points around this that we can hit on if we know that this is proved out to be correct? So, it's really almost about doubling down on things that have worked well in the past and then building more of that because you've already proven out an audience for that type of content.
What is some of the most kind of important contents that brands should be starting to create? Is it making sure that all the emails have the correct voice? Is there some foundational content or blog posts that they could be writing? Where should a brand start in terms of the actual writing if they have a small team?
It's a little bit of like a chicken or the egg situation where you want to create content, but then how do you distribute it? So I think it's really important the distribution engine around content because you can't rely on or count on a blog post just by itself magically doing well, or a social media post if you don't have a following. So if I was a brand, I would just start email collection as early as possible and offering value upfront through a newsletter because the larger your subscriber list is, the better you'll be able to get other content in front of them. So if you're a single content person, marketer at a company, um, really just offering value and not you know look like really focusing on churn for, I think, the newsletter is important. And then not always feeling like you have to sell things to people. Some of my favorite newsletters from brands maybe at the bottom say like buy X or like check out whatever, go to the site, but 99% of it is not related to transactional emails or getting you back on the site. So that's just like a really early win because ultimately, once you build your newsletter list, your content, your social will all kind of be able to shine better.
Natalie is looking at hundreds of brands every day, and I wanted to know what brands create great newsletters for their customers.
My favorite example is definitely Heyday. Its newsletter is amazing. It's a facial company. They also have an e-commerce arm that sells skincare products, and they are just really timely with the things that they cover. So, for example, it's like how to deal with dry skin in the winter, and then not only do they have like the product discovery aspect of it because here are the products on Heyday, but they also talk to an expert or a dermatologist, and then they're answering those questions that you might have in a way that feels really relevant. I think in some cases, like the timeliness aspect of content for brands is really important because, this might live on the internet forever, which is why, a lot of content marketing might be evergreen focused, but you can really have a lot of wins if you think about creating a sense of urgency around it. Like, why is this brand talking about this right now? So I really love that newsletter. Also, Zuzu is a really fun like tequila seltzer drink. And I think their newsletter is really amazing because they focus on the visuals a lot. So it's kind of like things that we like right now or things that are inspiring us a little bit more curation focused than just, here's our product. So I think brands could offer so much more value through emails by not just, talking about the product itself, by focusing on the area around it and like what else might be interesting to readers or your customers. If you've already got their email, then what else can you offer them that's valuable?
How can a brand develop authority in their space through content? And why would that be important for building a brand long term?
It's really interesting. We did a story on why brands are using science and why they're paying for scientific studies. And I think that as people look at different brands and try to make an informed purchase decision, they're looking for things like authority, especially in areas like skincare. So, why are these skincare brands or non-alcoholic brands or functional brands or adaptogenic things like investing in science is because they want to build the authority. And especially through writing and content, the best way to build authority is by doing your research and trying to make it not as much about you as it is helpful or useful to the reader. So I think the reason why people and companies do white papers is because they're trying to add value and knowledge to the ecosystem. So if I'm reading an article or a blog post from a brand that has data, expert interviews, original research, I'm going to see that as authoritative. But if I'm reading a blog post from a brand that is almost all content marketing and it's CTAs and it's like very clearly like an SEO play, then maybe it'll answer my question, but I won't necessarily see that as, authority. So I would say like the more kind of work you do around it to involve things like stats and experts, probably the better it's going to be.
Outside of like a white paper and, brands investing in science, what are some other ways that brands can build authority or at least establish trust with brands? Because maybe they don't have the money to do a scientific research paper.
I think it's really about feeling really up to date on what's going on in the space, right? So if I subscribe to a brand's newsletter and I know that I can open that newsletter and it'll give me all the news pertaining to like their specialty area, then that's really helpful. So I think that, if companies are like short on resources around that specifically, it would just be around staying up to date on like what's going on, what are some trends to know, because if you are buying from a coffee company and then they have a newsletter that's really interesting around like what's going on in coffee or like other brands they like or anything that feels like it's a little bit more well-rounded versus just a really straightforward come back and buy from us. I think that's helpful. So authority doesn't necessarily need to mean quotes and experts and stats and data in the format of blog posts, but it could also be, you know, offering content that's valuable around the area if people might want to dive deeper into it.
We've talked a lot about how brands are doing great things or finding success, but let's talk about some mistakes because, again, you are looking at lots of brands. So, what are some common mistakes you see brands when they are attempting to write content or their newsletters? What are you seeing as something that's, commonly mistaken, but then how could we prevent that from happening?
It's really interesting because as brands think about where they're spending time and money, they want to see things pay off, right? They want to kind of see immediate metrics from that. And this is something that's also frustrating to brands in terms of PR and like the things that are a little bit more vague. So I think that a common mistake or, misstep for brands as they approach content is not investing in it for the long term and saying this is like an actual core piece of our value proposition as a brand and saying, let's bring on this person, let's bring on, contractors, let's launch a magazine, and trying to do too much at once and then not feeling, the commitment to continue things if they're not immediately doing well. So I think, deciding whether or not it is kind of a core piece of the business and what it's offering customers. And it's totally fine to try things or do a print magazine or, do a newsletter, but once you start doing something, you might upset people if you stop. So I would just think really thoughtfully around what would the long-term goal would be. Whoever's managing the content, like what are success metrics for that person that are realistic? A lot of content doesn't immediately overnight take off. So is it a long-term play? And really just like setting expectations for what content at the brand looks like in a sustainable way that's not trying to do too much.
What should brands be looking for when it comes to, okay, we need to have somebody that can be our kind of content partner? What should people look for to make sure that they're getting the right person for their brand?
Understanding the tone is really important and the perspective that the brand has, and then not producing anything that's like so cookie cutter that it could be, you could swap out the brand name and it could be any other brand producing that. So I think having, a point of view as the person who you're hiring and knowing that that person can kind of run and experiment a little bit is really helpful. But also just again, knowing that if you have one content person or one freelancer, one social media person, creating resources and support for them because it can be a very lonely job if you're the only one doing it, and in some cases it can be something that is a little bit harder to manage if you're not focused on that side of the business. So someone who's going to be a self-starter and know when to run with things or kill them if they're not taking up or if they're not like showing the value of other things, but yeah, someone who's going to be pretty definitive in how they feel about running the content program.
Previous to Thing Testing, Natalie was a journalist at Forbes. One great way to build authority as a brand is to use the power of PR. But PR is sometimes vague and there isn't a clear path to getting mentioned by news outlets. I wanted to get Natalie's perspective on how brands should start to approach PR.
I've seen this from literally every angle now because at Forbes, I was pitched, by companies and by PR agencies. And then at my last job at a venture capital firm, I gave a lot of advice to brands and portfolio companies on how to approach it kind of from the founder perspective and supporting them. And then now at Think Testing, I work for a company that would, in a scenario, be pitching itself. So I've seen this kind of from every angle. And, a good way to approach PR is if you bring on an agency, like me being like super aligned and like feeling, like you can trust that agency and knowing that things don't happen overnight. So there's a level of empathy, I think, that also relates to this year where, you could publish a blog post or push out content and it might not take off immediately. Same is true with PR. You have to kind of like feel like it's a long-term thing that's going to be important to your business. But I think, at the end of the day, founders who are communicating directly with reporters is going to be a really authentic relationship building opportunity. A lot of times PRs, for better or worse, reaches out when there's news, right? Hey, cover this. Hey, like this is pay attention, like this is going on. But ultimately, at that point, the brand has not offered value before it's asked a reporter to cover it. So, my advice to founders is always try to create a relationship or offer value before you need something from a reporter. Can you be a source? Can you share information on what's going on? Can you be an expert? Hey, I think like there's a story here. All of those things are going to be, more valuable over time versus just saying, "Hey, I exist. Will you cover this thing?" So a lot of people just call it relationship building, which I think is accurate, but I think it's more about, you know, offering value before you're asking for a favor.
How would somebody go about building that relationship with a journalist?
One super easy thing to do is follow reporters on Twitter, right? Follow reporters on Twitter. If they tweet something, hey, looking into this, who should I talk to? Offer help there. Even if it's not about you, here's a resource, here's a source. Make introductions. It's always beneficial, even if have a relationship with a reporter at that point, saying, I think it'd be really awesome if you met this person because they might be really helpful down the road. And then even if you're not quoted in that, then you've like done something that's actually meaningfully helpful. So I think creating like the digital touch points initially are really helpful. So following these reporters, trying to be helpful if they tweet out things. And then over time, you just become less of a random person and you're, a person who's part of their followers or community. And then, making it less, uncomfortable to reach out for a coffee. Hey, like, do you want to catch up? I'd love to tell you about this or like see if I can be helpful with anything you're working on, are kind of like the magic words. In some cases, if reporters are getting a million of those, it's like, okay, no, like I'm fine. But, reporters often like to bounce ideas off of founders. Hey, are you seeing this too? Like, is this relevant? Should I explore the story? So if you're a person that gets on a texting basis with a reporter who looks to do that, I think it's like the highest value relationship that you can create. But just like being a person next to the brand versus the brand versus the PR agency is always going to be the most authentic way to build that.
You spent all this time bringing value to the journalist. Now it's time for you to make that big ask about covering your company. I wanted to know when the time is right, how do you make that ask in a genuine way?
If you have regular coffee meetings or check-ins or, just quarterly meetups with this person, it's not going to feel super random or out of left field. Reporters like know that's the long game, right? So, oh, why is this person trying to help me? It's not like completely altruistic. So I think that eventually kind of the expectation is, oh, like, hey, I have news now. Like, do you want to hear it? And then it's a little bit more comfortable feeling versus just cold pitching. So as much as you can kind of keep the relationship alive in a way that's not bothering them, but also helpful, um, is a good kind of lead in to when you do have that because it's like not going to be out of the blue that you want someone to cover you after you've been talking to them for a while.
How would a brand measure success for PR?
PR for brands, like specifically D2C brands, like they just really focus a lot on kind of brand roundups and like gift guides and like being in kind of those curation stories. And then also like specifically for brands, new launches is really important. And they use that as a moment for PR. I think that one measure of PR is if you get more PR from it. So if you do a story and then people start reaching out to you, then that's a really good sign that it's getting noticed. A lot of people use things like impressions or reach. I don't really think that's that helpful. I think whether you get more signups to the site, if you get customers, being able to track those types of things, and then getting more inquiries about PR and more people wanting to talk about you because, like, oh, we should pay attention to this company because I just saw it written up elsewhere is a good measure. But a lot of metrics kind of tied to PR are a little ambiguous. But I think one thing that founders and VCs and kind of the whole tech world needs to understand is that it could take a really long time to get a high impact story. And would you prefer a really high impact print story with a staff writer somewhere or a bunch of smaller hits online? How you measure success through PR is what you want to get out of it. And I think a lot of people just similarly don't know how to like set expectations in a way that makes the most of their agency. And then like, people aren't going to cover every new product launch, so use content to create buzz around that. Don't rely on just an agency because people are not going to cover every single thing you do. So being able to package a story is really helpful versus kind of smaller pieces of things going on.
You get your first PR hit, but how do you leverage this moment to help grow your brand?
For a lot of brands, the first media touch point is usually their funding round. And those types of instances, what I really love to suggest that founders do is write a blog post, kind of in their own words, explain what was going on. And then also having the coverage, I think, is very beneficial. But using media to kind of share a story, but also knowing that their job is not to verbatim share every single thing that you want to get out in the open. It's to share a point of view that's going to be most beneficial to the reader. So as a brand, the way to leverage that, is through social proof. Put on the website, hey, you've seen us here. That's really popular. A lot of brands I see also do paid spend behind articles, media coverage on Facebook. So creating a campaign around it, maybe saying like, look what Forbes said about us, come check it out here, and leveraging other people's voices. At the end of the day, the reason why people do PR and they want to get in front of media is because it's like another validation, versus just a brand saying, hey, I'm awesome. It's Fast Company saying, hey, this brand is cool. So trying to use that extra voice as a way that offers more authority to the brand, really, on why people should pay attention to them.
So, to finish out this interview, we're going to do a few quick fire questions. The first question is, what is one tech company in the e commerce space that you've been a fan of lately?
I really have recently gotten to know the marketer hire team a little bit better, and they're really, really nice. And actually look forward to the newsletter in a real way because what they do is they use Twitter kind of as an engine to fuel the newsletter. So they'll ask questions, and then based off of what's going on in the Twitter conversation, it'll appear in the newsletter. So they're doing a really good job kind of tapping into the community to inform what content goes in there. And you feel like you have a little bit more buy in or say in what you're going to see, but they also have relevant reads, thoughts from experts, tactical things. I'm probably most bored with newsletters that are like 100% tactical versus a little bit more curated. So I think they do a really great job with their tone and how they approach the content they're offering.
What's a D2C brand that you think is awesome? I'm curious about this answer because you're looking at like thousands of brands like every day. So, curious which one has kind of been at the peak for you.
It's Fishwife, so it's a tinned fish company, and I think part of why I love it is the novelty of it. So it's kind of a boring category that, they've brought a new perspective to in a sustainable way, but the branding is fun, and you just follow them on social, and people just, like, love to share UGC of their tinned fish. I've been shared on their Instagram before too. Here's my everything bagel, smoked salmon, tin fish, bagel. So I think that they have just a really fun voice, and they've done things like merch collaborations, and people like actually really want to wear Hot Girls Eat Tin Fish. And I think it's amazing. So I think the reason why it resonates is because when you have a product that's good and like it's a good product, you don't need to overdo it on how you talk about it. But if you have a product that's like not as good, maybe you're more marketing focused. So I think people genuinely like Fishwife because the way that the brand talks to them is just like a niche where you feel like you want to engage with them because they feel like a friend. So I'm a big Fishwife fan.
I finish off the podcast with a segment called Open Mic. This is a chance for my guests to share anything they want. A lot of times, I feel like people get stuck behind the industry they are in, but we are all human and have other interests outside of that. So, this is a space for my guests to say whatever they want to say.
One thing that I really like to talk about, I do a ton of informational interviews with college students who went to my school, who didn't go to my school, people who are looking to switch careers, move into content, move out of content, move into journalism, out of VC into VC. is career pathing. So I think that I've essentially now been in 3 careers, right? So I started in journalism. I was at Forbes working on 30 Under 30. I was there for 2.5 years, and then went into VC and then startups. So the thinking behind that was a lot about always optimizing for what skills you want to learn at every phase of your career. So from Forbes, I knew that I loved talking to founders and startups, and entrepreneurship was so fascinating to me, and writing about them and creating content around these amazing ideas. So how could I work more closely with founders? At that point, I don't think I was ready to join a startup, but I saw VC as an amazing way to create content and support founders and deepen that connection that I had with the people who made under 30 who were so inspiring. So then moving to VC and having the opportunity to create content around these founders and like actually meaningfully help them with the problems that they had. And then the logical next step would be still in the content business, but then actually working with a founder at a startup. So I think that, one thing I like to talk about a lot is career pathing based off of what's like the logical next evolution of your skills, right? So I went from being in a newsroom to being a solo content, like director of branded content for a VC firm. And now I have the opportunity to kind of grow people around me to build out a content program and operation at Think Testing. So I think that as content people, marketers think about career pathing, like what skills are they looking to kind of double down on, and what opportunities would they be really excited to have next? Because Think Testing was like an obvious place for me to go based off of where I wanted to grow my skills as a content leader and social media person and, hopefully manager. So, yeah, if you look at it, you're like, wait a minute, 3 places. But then when you kind of explain it in the creating a closer relationship with founder kind of entrepreneurism while keeping the content thread, it kind of makes sense.
This conversation with Natalie helped me see the power of writing for brands as well as understand how to win at PR. You can follow Natalie on Twitter at N_Sportelli. We will also put more information about Think Testing linked in the show notes. Thank you, Natalie, for being on the show. If you like the show, drop a rating on Apple Podcasts or your podcast listening app. And if you really love this show, please share this episode with a friend. Thank you in advance.